Hello and welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast, where we interview business leaders and emerging market experts on business innovations, market opportunities, and macro-level trends in emerging and frontier market countries. Join us for the next hour to dive deep into the world of emerging markets as we speak with top performers who are successfully investing, working, and living in these markets themselves. Welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Lahl, and today we are joined by Yana Yasevich, who is partner and head of platform at Alter Global, which is an early-stage VC firm focused on emerging markets across the world. Since 2015, they've partnered with over 44 exceptional ventures in cities like Jakarta, Dhaka, Lahore, Buenos Aires, Manila, São Paulo, Mexico City, Lagos, Cairo, Bogota, and many more. Their thesis lies in the belief in individual change, supporting high-character founders who are building not only their companies, but their communities and countries as well. They match their founders with talent, expertise, and investments from Silicon Valley and beyond. Leading the platform team at Alter, Yana spends her days working with portfolio companies to support them in their day-to-day development and growth. Prior to Alter, Yana co-founded a sleep and wellness company in San Francisco, which she grew to over $1 million annual recurring revenue, and led product development teams at Estee Lauder in New York. So really happy to have you on. I'm really excited to learn more about the work that you're doing at Alter, but because I think that you have a really interesting model for driving growth in these markets. But I was wondering if you could start out just by sharing a little bit more about your background and where your interest in emerging markets initially came from.
Of course. And first of all, thank you so much for having us on. It's always a real pleasure and just a great chance to talk about emerging markets and their opportunity, but also our team has such close connection to INSEAD as an organization. So it's fun to get to be a part of this. One of our team members who leads our investments in Latin America is an INSEAD alum, and our platform and operations associate is an incoming student in January. So really enjoy getting to do something that's a part of the broader INSEAD community. And for me personally, I think my familial background actually has played a really big role in my interest in emerging markets. I was born in Moscow, and my parents and I immigrated to the Bay Area when I was a young child. And despite growing up here in the heart of Silicon Valley, like many immigrant children, I always felt split between two worlds. And I think that really shaped me. I didn't feel like I fully belonged in traditional American cultures or circles. And at the same time, I obviously wasn't a purely Russian child because I was growing up here and living my life here. And the impact that this had on me is that I was really fascinated in deeply understanding other cultures, why people do what we do, what people are driven by. I studied international business and diplomacy at NYU and was really fascinated by these questions of people's drive and motivations, the decision-making factors or elements, and how international trade functions today, and what areas it could be stronger and what areas maybe it falls short of delivering on what it could. So working at Alter feels very full circle for me. It's the first time professionally where I have felt such a deep fit between my personal background, my operational skill set, and my business interests and vision.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that for a lot of us who come from that sort of immigrant background, we grow up having our education in the US, but there is still that pull of our hearts somehow of knowing that there is work that can be done internationally. And it is really cool that you found a way to be able to do that and connect the two. Before we get to Alter, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, it's pretty cool that you launched your own startup, and would just love to briefly learn a little bit more about that and maybe how that experience has helped you doing what you do now in terms of advising all the startups that you guys work with.
Of course. So for a bit of context, at the very, very beginning of 2020, I co-founded a consumer sleep and wellness company. When we were starting, we focused primarily on producing and selling custom night guards to consumers for 80% less than the cost of the dentist. It's a product in a space that seems niche, but actually affects more than 40% of the population. And I had two primary drivers for joining my university classmate and wanting to start a company. The first was I was really interested in more deeply and practically understanding the process of going from 0 to 1. I think there's a lot of learning that you can pick up on starting a company by listening to the experiences of others, but there's very little tactical day-to-day knowledge that you can gain in terms of how to incorporate your business, how to raise your first dollars, figure out the source of funding to go after, how to price your product for the first time, spend your first marketing dollars, hire an agency, etc., without going through the process. And so the first driver for me was on a very practical operational skill set level. I wanted to understand what were the elements that made up actually starting that process. And then the second was more personally, intrinsically driven, which was that I wanted to show myself that I could take a leap of faith on myself. And regardless of how things turned out, I would be okay. And I think that's worth mentioning because so often we don't necessarily get to hear about the ways in which people's self-development goals drive their decision making. But in this case, it was actually a really big part of my journey, and it has had a huge impact on how I now work with our founders, because the first thing is that it's just given me a tremendous level of respect for our founders and the commitment that they're making when they're choosing to start a company, particularly in emerging markets. And I think it's also given me an ability to empathize with them as people and as operators in a way that I couldn't have fully before. I absolutely see our founders as the true heroes. And for me, I see our job then as doing two things: to find the folks that we believe are truly exceptional and what we think of as inevitable individuals, the kind of people that will inevitably have an enormous impact on just the spaces that they're in, be they in certain realms of business or just in general, they have that inevitability quality to them. So the first is to find those people. And the second is to make their journey forward as smooth as possible in whatever capacity we can. But they really are the ones that deserve the attention and all of our support and energy.
Amazing. Yeah. I think that, first of all, being an entrepreneur just forces you to learn so much more than you would in any job. And then to the personal development piece,
absolutely.
I think that empathy is something that a lot of entrepreneurs, they may complain about VC firms not knowing what the experience of being an entrepreneur is. So the fact that you can come there with that empathy, I think, is a huge differentiating factor for Alter and for you in your role. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you think sets Alter apart from other VC firms, not just VC firms in general, but maybe even in emerging markets. What about your model is different, and how do you approach things in a different way than a lot of other VC firms may approach them?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to wrap up with the prior point, I think I'll double down also on the importance of humility, frankly, in this business. I think something that I've heard reiterated over and over again from folks that have been in the industry for 20, 30, 40 years that I really admire is a consistent thread in what they share is the need to constantly remain humble about what you do and don't know and what you are considering the status quo or the playbook or the truth, because as soon as you become fixed in your ideas around those things, you really limit your ability to be maximally effective as an investor. And part of it is being humble about what you know and what you don't know, and also then translating that to the ways in which you interact with both your current founders and founders that might be interested in working with you as a firm. So I try every day to have that be a central quality in how we interact with our portfolio companies. And I feel very grateful that the people that I work with every day also feel the same, because it feels like a different kind of relationship that we have with our founders relative to many other firms that we see. And to the question that you asked specifically about Alter and what differentiates us as a firm, if it's okay with you, I know that the podcast in general focuses on emerging markets. So naturally, we think that the majority of people that come and listen are already quite well versed in them. But I always think it's valuable to go back to a primer on some of the fundamentals on how large these markets are, because I think that's what's missing for a lot of people interested in venture capital or entrepreneurship in general, is this very deep understanding of how incredibly massive these markets are. So just to purely look at some macroeconomic factors, 6 of the world's 7 largest economies by 2050 are projected to be emerging markets. And that's led by and includes China, India, Indonesia on the massive side. But it also includes countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Egypt, Brazil, and many, many more. especially as we talk about the list of the top 20 or 30. And the group of emerging markets in general, it reflects about 50% of the world's GDP as of 2023, and close to 66-67% of global GDP growth over the last decade. So I think it's just valuable to double down on them again, because the opportunity, I think, based on a lot of the conversations that I have with folks, is just sometimes not understood in its full scope. And I want to emphasize these things because it's what makes us excited to operate in this space. And so Alter specifically, we are, exactly as you said, Nick, an early stage emerging market focused fund. So we invest pre-seed through Series A in parts of Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Within Latin America, we invest in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina. Within Africa and the Middle East, we invest in Egypt, Nigeria, the UAE, and we're starting to explore potentially Kenya and Saudi Arabia. And in South and Southeast Asia, we're actively invested in India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and the Philippines. And we're beginning to explore Vietnam. And in terms of what I think makes us unique, beyond already being an early stage firm focused cross-regionally in these emerging markets, which is quite rare, I think it's that we try to really hone in on what is it that only we can do? What is it from a value perspective that really only we can bring? And what that has looked like has really evolved over time. When we first started investing in 2020 through probably the beginning of this year, we saw our core value add as being four things: our fellowship program, which I'm happy to touch on later, the future financing support that we help our companies with, so helping match them with other funds that may invest in them in the future, help them prepare all of their materials for fundraise, etc. The global network and connections piece, so sharing a lot of learnings between these markets with founders, introducing them to one another so they can speak, things like that. And then the last piece is really the human relationships and deep trust and empathy that we can build amongst one another. I think historically, those were the things that really set us apart. And now, also back to the piece around humility and evolution, it's a little bit of an open question on moving forward into this next year, into the next few years. What is Alter's unique value add going to look like? How can we be maximally supportive to our companies in the way that is actually relevant and helpful for them? And so in these last couple of months in particular, during the summer, when things move a little bit slower, it's been a really good moment for us to internally regroup as an organization and deepen our skill sets, particularly on some of the quantitative modeling side of things, to deepen and expand the relationships that we have with growth stage partners that might be fits for our companies in the future, and things like that.
Yeah, emerging markets are surprisingly not covered as much as they should be. And this podcast is kind of an attempt to get more knowledge out there, because it is just where the future of humanity is. And clearly that's where companies should be looking when it comes to potential. And it seems like Alter has a great approach, and you've probably learned a lot along the way and adapted over time, which it seems like you have a lot of really interesting offerings to your startups. And one thing that stood out to me in the description when I looked at the company and also your overview of it was that you are very focused on the founders and finding ones that you think are inevitable, as you put it. I was wondering if you could talk more about that focus, why you are so founder focused, and how you do determine whether a founder is one that would fit the mold of being the sort of role model for their ecosystem that you look for. What background or values might they have? How have you determined that this is the right type of person to go after? And what have you learned along the way to validate that?
Great questions. And I think the answer is uniquely different based on whether we take the lens of how we choose certain founders and how we choose certain business models. They, in some ways, are very connected, but the actual characteristics are slightly different. So thinking about the founders themselves first, and what we mean when we think about this inevitability that they possess. Being a founder anywhere is really difficult, but in some ways, sitting in the Silicon Valley or sitting in New York or London, we've had enough large success stories over the last 15 years or so that being an entrepreneur has a bit of an exciting aura about it too. Beyond a recognition of how difficult it is, there is also a lot of awareness of its potential and how big it can become. In emerging markets where the field of tech entrepreneurship is still very much in its nascency, you don't have as many of those examples. And in those markets, and emerging markets are economically and politically more volatile traditionally. In those markets, pursuing a path that is more traditional, less risk, it's not even a risk appetite per se, but it's rather one that diminishes that risk maximally and provides internal stability, typically is the preferred route. Because if you're operating in an environment that is already potentially financially scarce and more volatile, it makes sense that you wouldn't be more inclined to rock the boat in that way or to put yourself potentially in the position of opening up to that risk. But what we have found in our founders and in others that are building in emerging markets is that exactly for that reason, if you are still, despite all of those things, choosing to start a company, you typically have an inner drive and an inner determination and tenacity that is unbeatable. And those are the folks that we really want to find, the people that are undeterred as much as possible by the inevitable roadblocks that they are up against and that are truly prepared to be in this business and this line of work for the next decade plus. It's so easy in general to think of entrepreneurial success stories as this big overnight explosion of growth and success. But in emerging markets in particular, there are a lot of amazing examples of overnight success stories being 15 years in the making, as they say. I think there's so much validity and truth to that. We don't necessarily see that part of the journey and the successful outcomes that we all elevate as examples. But truthfully, this journey of building a company takes a decade plus, and that is especially true in emerging markets where you do have many more challenges up against you. And so the tenacity, the inevitability, the sheer determination and passion is one piece. I think the other that Alter specifically also cares quite a bit about is whether or not that person is equally excited and eager to invest in other entrepreneurs around them. So, especially in moments when they have had some degree of liquidity or success, are they going to invest part of that capital back into the entrepreneurs around them in those regions? Or do they see their success as maybe zero sum potentially? Which, by the way, I don't think is typically common in emerging markets in general. There is much more of a success is not a zero sum game attitude. It's something that I really love about working in these markets. But that is just another factor that we're thinking of how much is this person just committed to the development of the tech ecosystem that they're in, period, long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're investing in emerging markets, you definitely always need to have the long term in mind. And that is where the returns will be, is if you are ready to look for a 15 or 20-year return. This is the part of the world that you should be looking at, but there may be volatility in the shorter term.
Almost guaranteed there will be.
Right. And it's great that you are emerging market focused in general. I think people may look at emerging markets be like, it's risky, but if you are diversified across emerging markets across the world, I think that does deal with some of that volatility a little bit, because a lot of these markets are not correlated with each other, which is one of the benefits of investing in them. But to your other point, it is a sure sign that the person is committed if they're trying to do it in these countries. It's still not cool to be an entrepreneur in a lot of these places like it is in the US or maybe more developed markets. You probably are going against your family and everyone who might be telling you that it doesn't make sense to do it. And so clearly need to be a pretty determined person. To your last one, I'd just be curious to understand a little bit better. Let's say someone is an early stage founder. How would you test or know whether they're someone who is committed to developing the ecosystem there?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll start at a high level and then I'll answer the question directly if that's all right. When I think about the difference in entrepreneurship between traditional markets that we think of, US, Europe, maybe parts of Asia, and I think about emerging markets, on a fundamental level, I think the day-to-day challenges that companies experience are the same. The day-to-day challenges are companies trying to find product market fit, figure out their go-to-market strategies, increase their customer retention numbers, decrease their churn, figure out scale. Those challenges are the same. Those are just the fundamentals of starting a business, period. Where I think emerging markets fundamentally differ or have a greater challenge than more traditional markets is in two areas: access to future financing and ultimate exit. When it comes to access to future financing, it becomes a question of, okay, once you get to the series B, C, D, maybe you're looking at pre-IPO levels of funding. Maybe you are interested in exploring debt financing in addition to traditional equity. At that point in time, are there going to be available avenues of financing? And it is limited today in emerging markets. And so part of what I see our challenge as being is to go and build more meaningful long-term relationships with the funds that are providing that capital today globally so that they can start allocating part of it to emerging markets. The second element around exits is also a really big question, because we've had a couple of really meaningful examples, both of IPOs in US markets, for example, Nubank in Brazil now being publicly listed in the US and performing very well, or InstaDeep in Tunisia, for example, being acquired for many hundreds of millions of dollars in the last couple of years for all of their development work that they've done. There are a couple of examples starting to come, but it's still very early days. These markets are nascent in general from a tech entrepreneurship perspective. And so the second is that piece. How this relates then to the kinds of founders that we want to back is that naturally these markets can only be or will be maximally effective if there are many more examples of deeply successful entrepreneurs coming out of them and being able to both access later stage funding and exiting either through an acquisition or through an IPO, either domestically or abroad. That then we're really looking for the founders that are maybe starting to write angel checks, or they are actively referring to their existing investors, other founders that we think they should talk to, or they are speaking to their universities about entrepreneurship and trying to find and recruit great talent to join their teams. Those are some of the practical examples and qualities of those folks that we're looking for, because we think that it begins with them, but ultimately it all affects this longer term goal of getting more attention and access and funding into venture capital in emerging markets specifically, so that this general ecosystem can grow.
Absolutely. That makes sense. I was wondering if you could also just talk a little bit about beyond just the individuals, because you did mention that business model is also another criteria. If you could talk more about what you look for in the startups that you invest in, and maybe some of the startups you're more excited about that Alter's invested in.
Definitely. So as investors, Alter specifically, we are technically sector agnostic, but we do focus on a couple of sectors in particular based on our historical portfolio to date and what we think will come in the coming quarters and years. The majority of our investments are split across either fintech or commerce enablement in some capacity. And so within that, we can dive a little bit deeper. Within fintech, obviously, there's financial infrastructure tooling. Then there is potentially crypto or blockchain development, as well as insurance. And we're invested in all three of those verticals. So on the fintech and infrastructure side, for example, we are investors in an end-to-end spend management platform in Mexico and Brazil called Clara. We're investors in a card issuance company called Pomelo in Argentina, serving the broader Latin American market. We're investors in an early stage Middle East financial infrastructure tool focused on specifically connecting pay in and pay outs in the Middle East across countries called Fuse, and several others like that. On the insurance model side, we're investors in companies like Amenli in Egypt or Asos in Brazil that are specifically trying to increase the access and availability of day-to-day citizens in Egypt and Brazil, respectively, to insurance products, be it for medical, home, life insurance coverage, et cetera. So that's on the fintech side. With commerce enablement, that can take a number of different views or approaches to it as well. So one of them can be specifically on the logistics and e-commerce fulfillment piece of things. And a couple of the companies that we're invested in there include Cargo in Indonesia, Melon in Colombia, Flextalk in Egypt, and several others like that. And so specifically focusing on ultimately once the customer has ordered said product online, how does it actually get to them, both in terms of last mile, but also in terms of the warehouse that it needs to route to, the system within the warehouse to connect it to a last mile provider, and so forth. And it also could take the lens of financing for those companies and those transactions. It can take the lens of B2B marketplaces that are specifically trying to connect those businesses in these markets with the goods that they need on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps provide them also with the inventory financing to do so, et cetera. We have made a couple of investments also into the education and healthcare spaces, but those are much more early for us today. So we're interested in learning more about them, but we recognize that it's not our area of expertise yet. I would say the areas that we are not actively looking into to learn more about today are deep tech, bio specifically, and hardware. And part of that is just because it's not our area of expertise as a team. And as a small team in general that is globally distributed, there's only so much that we can do at any given time. And so those are areas that don't necessarily have our attention today, but we're always interested in general, seeing how these markets are evolving and trying to continuously educate ourselves about their evolution. And for the businesses specifically, in terms of what we're looking for, I mean, we are early stage investors. So we start investing sometimes pre-product, pre-revenue, very, very, very pre-seed. And sometimes we'll come in and begin our journey with a company once they actually have an initial subset of customers and revenue coming in and more quantitative information to look at. So for us, fundamentally, it's looking at the market that they're operating in, who the founders are, what they're driven by, what they want to build. And then in general, could we build a thesis around this as to why we think there's an interesting opportunity here?
Amazing. And I think that thesis makes sense. I mean, the deep tech and all that is exciting, but I feel like there's just such a huge opportunity in these emerging markets for just the basic things that allow people to live, whether that's, financing or logistics. A lot of these countries have the opportunity to build these things without competing with legacy infrastructure. And since these countries are going, these are where the people are going to be. These are going to be wealthier in the future. There's just such a huge opportunity there, and it's exciting to be part of that. And so I think it makes sense to be focused on that. But I guess moving on to the markets that you work out of, I was wondering what you look for in an emerging market that you invest in, if there are any that you wouldn't invest in, or how you picked which markets to work out of.
Yeah, it's a great question because emerging markets represent an enormous percentage of the world, and we're certainly not covering all of them today. First and foremost, it's a question of what can we do with the team that we have? We are a team of 4 people full-time split across different parts of the world and our 2 general partners. And so we're already covering quite a number of countries amongst that group, but we recognize that there could be more that we could do if we were also larger. And so as of today, we're trying to focus our efforts on the countries that we see as the highest potential from an entrepreneurial perspective today. And I'll emphasize the word today because I think it's equally important to recognize that these things evolve and change. And so, for example, when we first began investing 4 years ago, we were investors in Brazil and Indonesia, in India. We were starting to explore opportunities in Nigeria, but we hadn't yet made our first investments in Egypt. We hadn't yet made our first investments in Colombia or Argentina. And even in the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, these markets have massively evolved and grown. And so today we're focusing on a smaller subset because this is where the majority of the opportunity that we're excited about is coming from, but it very well will evolve and frankly expand in terms of the number of countries that we're investing into in the future. I think Brazil and India are maintaining their early dominance in these markets, primarily from a fintech perspective. They are just within emerging markets a bit more mature than the others. I think the primary driver of that, frankly, is their size. And then beyond that, just a couple of early exits coming from them and then building the ecosystem from within through that. Nigeria, Bangladesh, Egypt. I think these are countries that are really meaningfully overlooked traditionally by US or European investors. These are countries with very high digital penetration rates, with a growing young population that's digitally native. So there's a lot of consumer behavior that we see come out of them that almost leapfrog what we see in other parts of the world. For example, if we think about our investments in the insurance space for a second, we are investors in a company called Amenli in Egypt and Azos in Brazil. The two companies are independently focused on how do you increase access to insurance products, life, home, medical, etc., to everyday populations in their countries. And if in emerged, let's call them markets, if in the US or Europe, for a period of time, people used to go in person to their insurance broker's office and sign paperwork to sign onto a plan. And then they started to create web platforms for this where maybe you didn't need to go in person into an office, but you could talk to someone on the phone and then sign up for your insurance plan. To now, maybe you can just sign up for an insurance plan in totality online. In emerging markets, so in Brazil and in Egypt, where the two countries that we're talking about, where these companies have evolved from, there was no stage really of people going in person, at least not in scale. And so instead, you have these massive population groups that are starting for the very first time to sign up for insurance products directly from their phones, where everything is happening digitally. And so it's really amazing actually to see how in some of these markets that were traditionally overlooked for the evolution of some industries, once those spaces are coming to them, they're leapfrogging where that technology goes and what it looks like today. And so it's been really exciting to invest in these sectors from that standpoint. The UAE and Saudi Arabia undoubtedly are growing at an exponential rate from an entrepreneurship standpoint. They are, from a legislative perspective, just so welcoming to entrepreneurs that they make it really approachable for founders, including from other emerging markets, to set up their initial headquarters there and to build from there outwards into the both Middle East and African regions. And yeah, I'll pause there, but I think those are some good ones.
For sure. I think that all of this makes emerging markets really exciting, not only to do business in, but just to live in, because coming from the more developed world and you go to the emerging markets and you feel like you're living in the future a lot of the time now. Just
absolutely.
There's so much that you can just do digitally there that you cannot do here. You're kind of getting to the incentives that are in places like Saudi Arabia or the UAE in terms of why it's good to start a business there. I was wondering if you could give any advice to people who are considering entrepreneurship in emerging market countries. What advice would you give them starting out, or if they were looking to work with Alter?
Absolutely. I'll take a little bit of a contrarian approach here, which is very apropos for an investor in general. But I always like to ask the question first to someone indicating that they're interested in venture dollars, of why venture dollars. I think it's important in general to remember that venture capital is one asset class example, and it's also one source of funding that could be a good fit for a company. And there are also companies that it very well isn't necessarily a fit for. And so for anyone starting a business, I think it's important to figure out initially what is the source of funding that is best relevant for you. And that could be venture dollars, but it also could be a grant, could be a traditional bank loan, could be raising a small amount of capital with friends and family, and then in general running a profit positive business, could be crowdfunding. I think understanding that first as a business is just a good starting point. And then from there, if you do decide that venture is the source of capital that is the right one for you, then rather than starting from some of the larger, more well-known firms, I would actually recommend that all entrepreneurs start by talking to some potential angels first. And so those potential angels could be startup founders whose companies have grown a bit and they've had some liquidity, or they are individuals working at larger corporates that could actually represent potential customers for entrepreneurs' companies that they're starting. I think those are great initial funders. Then I would talk to local funds or partners. So rather, again, than going to some of the larger international players for whom, as an entrepreneur, as a company, you might just be too early, start by talking to the local funds that you have. They're typically a great first source of capital because they also are so deeply embedded in those communities, in those ecosystems, that they're also really good sources of potential customer referral and just general business building support. And then I think another thing that I personally always want to convey to founders is start the conversation in general with anyone that you might want to partner with as an investor well before you're actually fundraising. As a fund, you will almost always take a conversation with an interesting entrepreneur if they don't necessarily approach the conversation from the perspective of looking for capital, but maybe are simply trying to get to know other funds or want to ask a question about how their business is evolving and the kinds of metrics that we're noticing relative to other companies. It changes the flow and the dynamic of the conversation. So I think in general, it's a good idea to start the conversation before you actually want to fundraise. And it goes both ways because entrepreneurs should choose the kinds of partners that they want to. I.e., do you want someone that will be really hands-on and actively involved in your day-to-day? Or do you prefer a more silent partner that gives you an amount of money that you need to move forward and then comes back to you in a year when either you are fundraising again or they want an annual update? And choosing that for yourself is also important as a founder. And the last thing that I would say that is more broad advice is I really think that founders should double down on making their pitch as clear as possible. I understand and completely recognize that when you are starting a business and you are in the weeds on understanding a space, and you also want to make yourself as attractive as possible to external investors, it feels like the approach is share all the detail, show that you are prepared, show all of the record of the traction that you've had so far, really get in the weeds on everything. But you have to remember that any LP that you approach, any VC rather, that you approach, has probably looked at 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 decks that week. And so instead, make your value proposition, make whatever it is that you are trying to build be as clearly understandable as possible. Make the deck as short as possible. Explain every slide and make sure that the writing on it is such that a 12-year-old would comprehend it fully. It's the very best piece of advice I think that I could possibly share, because so often the complexity of understanding a company or their traction so far is actually what turns investors away from pursuing the opportunity more. And for Alter specifically, if you are an early stage emerging market founder, if you are pre-product, if you are already working with a number of customers and you're looking to scale, but in general, if you're a founder in these markets and you're looking for a greater partnership, please reach out to us. We would love to talk to you. If nothing else, then we really fundamentally just believe in also building out these ecosystems. And similar to how we want to always partner with founders that aren't looking at success as a zero-sum game. The same applies to us. Really, the more activity, the more engagement that we get from other funds, other founders into these parts of the world, the better.
Sure. I think that's all really good advice. Back to your earlier point about empathy, I think it's also good for the entrepreneur to have empathy for the VC. If they understand what you're probably doing in your day-to-day, it'll make their pitch better as well. Until recently, it was kind of a badge of honor to get your VC round, but now people are exploring different ways. As you alluded to, I was wondering what sets Alter apart and what would make it advantageous to work with Alter over some of those other options, or what would be the right type of startup to work with Alter, I guess, would be another way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I think something that is valuable for founders, regardless of their geography, to understand well before they go speak to any investor is, how does the investor's business actually function? So how does a venture capital firm make money? Because that impacts then how does a venture capital firm make its investment decisions. So venture as an asset class really is doing two things at all times. You're optimizing for outlier returns, and that's happening via the power law. Like on the most basic level, the power law essentially conveys that out of 100% of the investments that you make, it's only the 20% that will lead 80% of your returns. So you're recognizing that within your portfolio, you, the fund, there's really going to be a couple of outliers that are going to drive the majority of your outcome. But because you don't know when you're making your investment decisions which of those will be the ones that'll drive the majority outcome, and you know that it will contribute to outlier returns, you're not looking for 1, 2, 3% annual growth on your investments. You're really looking for outcomes that can return your fund on their own as individual investments. So you're looking for companies that could potentially exit at 10, 20, 50, 100x of your investment. You always have to make the case for yourself internally as a fund that you have a reasonable degree of conviction that the investment that you are making could reach that scale. If it can't, if it can only reach a small success scale, it might be an excellent business model in general. It's just probably not a fit for venture dollars. And so for those founders, for those that are building perhaps more traditional service businesses, or maybe a consumer brand that could benefit from a little bit of an influx of capital, perhaps for marketing spend or for additional inventory that they could hold, venture is going to be a harder battle in terms of the kind of financing to acquire, because from a venture standpoint, if the potential exit opportunity isn't 10, 20, 50, 100x of the investment, the financials of it don't make sense for the fund to do. And I think this is really fundamental for founders to understand, because so often they may not understand why a firm is passing or why it's not interested in the opportunity. And that's where the conversation of market size really comes into play, and willingness to pay from potential customers, because ultimately that's the determinant on whether or not it makes sense from a pure business economic standpoint for a venture fund to make their investment.
Totally. Yeah. That's very valid in terms of, first of all, helping founders understand why they might get passed on it. And even if they don't, it just may not be the right model for them. And they're creating a lot of stress and potential failure that they wouldn't have to face otherwise. And they could still have a very successful exit and good lifestyle if they would just find another form of financing. So
right.
That's very helpful. I was wondering if you could maybe just talk personally also about what gets you out of bed every day. What are the most rewarding parts of your role at Alter? What's your why or your purpose that you have, and how does that align with your day-to-day, what you work on?
Oh, very happy to. I am so grateful every day that this is what I get to do. It's such a privilege and a joy, and I feel so intellectually challenged, stimulated in the best sense. And for me, I think part of it is I feel very grateful to be a drop in the bucket in terms of helping these economies grow. I mean, we really are approaching global development from a different lens, not by way of traditional aid, not by way of installing foreign talent in local roles, but by way of truly empowering local entrepreneurs who have the vision and operational skill set and passion to build products that are truly compelling, competitive, able to scale on a global technical level. Those are the things that's the approach that we're taking. And to be a drop in the bucket and driving that forward feels tremendously rewarding. The second piece is that I personally am really proud to be a woman in venture capital in a space that is largely still lacking in terms of female partners, in terms of female investors, female founders. And so being able to work in this realm, in this industry, is something that I also am proud of. And the last is just in general, I love challenging our own preconceived notions, my own included. I mean, working in these markets and working in an asset class specifically where ultimately our efficacy will be judged by our ROI and our ability to return capital and meaningfully expand its value. I think it's been an amazing challenge and journey in terms of understanding the incredible opportunity that lie in these markets and learning how to be better and better investors every day in terms of the investment decisions that we make, the companies that we choose to support, such that we can ultimately return that capital to our supporters and continue the process again. So this challenge of preconceived notions and the operational tasks that go along with it are also daily driver of what gets me out of bed.
For sure. I mean, developing markets, create social impact, challenging societal norms. These are all amazing ways to spend your life. So very great work that you are doing. You did touch on this a little bit in your last answer, but I was wondering if you have any more thoughts on social impact. You're saying that you're helping these countries in another way than aid would, but maybe especially since you are so technology focused. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how technology does drive social impact in these countries.
Absolutely. I see technology really as bringing access to information, access to goods, access to education, access to financial services. And it's exciting to be a part of this global narrative changing in these markets as a result of technology. So 10 years ago, primary conversation in the world was about how do we bring internet to these markets? Now, thousands of businesses have started because of the scale of digital penetration that exists in these markets. And we talked about a couple of industry examples earlier of how some industries are leapfrogging the traditional growth that the same sectors have experienced in other markets because of the massively fast rate of digital penetration that's occurred in them. But it applies to other sectors too. I mean, we've invested in so many companies whose core business models would be irrelevant or impossible if not for the rise of digital penetration that exists in their markets. In education, it is Maksat in Pakistan or Kolearn in Indonesia, companies who have fundamentally approached access to after-school tutoring through the lens of mobile-first learning. And baseline from day one, incorporating machine learning, AI, into how their models function such that they're able to respond to students' day-to-day needs. In logistics and in the supply chain digitization space, none of this would be possible or available as industries if not for the incredible rise of e-commerce that we've seen around the world. And so companies like Melon in Colombia, Shipper in Indonesia, Flexstock in Egypt, they are present and growing to the scale that they are today because of how much e-commerce has grown in these markets and the need to now build the infrastructure around it to support that. And so the same applies to other sectors as well. Healthcare, financial services, obviously, they're all growing in a completely different manner than they would have been 10 or 15 years ago because of how much digitization has changed so far and continues changing these markets.
Yeah, amazing. It's clear that there is definitely that huge opportunity, and we are at a lucky time in human history to be able to take advantage of that and grow economies, drive social impact, and just help a very large portion of humanity get to a point where they enjoy a lot of the things that they do. In places like the US where we're from. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more also about some of the challenges, because I'm sure it's not easy, especially you have a relatively small team and you're working in countries all over the world. So maybe if you could talk just about how you manage that challenge and also just some of the difficulties that you have faced in doing what you are trying to do.
Of course. Well, we've spoken about the bigger challenges that companies in these markets face as they scale that are unique to emerging markets, being access to future financing and exit opportunities in front of them. When it comes to our challenges in general as a team, then working in these markets, the ways that we first and foremost try to address that is by being globally distributed ourselves and being based in the regions that we serve. So I am our only team member in San Francisco, and I try to spend the majority of my time specifically working with our portfolio companies on how will they access future capital, how to best position themselves to be maximally competitive from a business model standpoint, and so forth. And I have 3 team members that are full-time and based in other parts. And then we work with a number of MBA students as well. So we have a team member in Cairo who focuses specifically on finding and sourcing new deal flow in the Middle East and Africa. She's phenomenal in her experience living in Egypt, and now also having residency in Dubai has meaningfully made a difference in terms of our ability to understand in the Middle East and Africa which are the opportunities to best pay attention to and where are the risks that we should also look out for. We have a team member who is from São Paulo who has worked across different parts of Latin America and different industries beforehand, who just best understands what's going on in these markets. And a similar team member based in India, from India, who's also spent time living and working in Indonesia, who again can understand the opportunities, the challenges, and just the operations of South and Southeast Asian markets better than anyone. So being physically based in the markets that we serve is a huge portion of it, of the way that we try to address that. We spend a lot of our time and energy also cultivating relationships with ecosystem partners in each of these markets. So specifically the regional funds that are investing also in Brazil or Indonesia or Pakistan or Nigeria, etc. We are constantly trying to expand our own learnings and understandings of these regions through literally learning and putting together different market reports. For example, we have been working with an exceptional Stanford GSB intern this summer to explore Vietnam a bit more as an ecosystem for us to potentially start investing into. And so he has worked with us to put together a report in general on what the state of venture and opportunity looks like in Vietnam today. And we're constantly trying to do exercises like this to better understand where we should be investing our time and our energy. And the last thing that I'll say is it is hard. These markets are more volatile, less certain, less predictable, and the outcomes really do take time. This is genuine patient capital working, where over the course of the next decade, I have fundamental conviction that there will be incredible business models and exits from these markets, but it does take time. And as investors working in this space, we have to not just understand that, but accept it and be prepared for it and excited by it. And personally, I think it's been really special to find a group of people to do this with that are, and it's tremendously rewarding in that capacity.
Yeah, I think that you guys have been very smart about not only finding individuals who have experience in multiple markets and then working with the local funds, which is a really great way to do it, not only for your own knowledge, but for ultimately helping your entrepreneurs raise. It's great to have those relationships. To the point that you mentioned about MBA students, I did read a little bit about your fellowship program, and I thought that that was really smart, and it does set you apart from what other VCs are doing. So I was wondering if you could just give a little bit of an overview of what that is and how it has helped you with the startups that you've invested in.
Absolutely. I think it's a very, very special program. So happy to speak about it. So before Alter became a for-profit firm, we actually existed as a nonprofit for a handful of years. And during that time frame, when we were actively trying to understand what kind of support we could offer our founders beyond capital investment, since that wasn't something available to us at the time. The fellowship program was really born out of it. And so the impetus was founders sharing that outside of capital, the thing that they were really looking for the most to add to their teams was high quality talent, and not necessarily having a huge pool of local operators that could bring, for example, some of the consulting experience or operational frameworks that US or European multinational companies offer. And so the premise of the fellowship is that we match early stage professionals, so typically people with anywhere from 2 to 6 years of experience, with one of our portfolio companies, and they go and physically join them, live and work with them on the ground for 6 to 12 months. The folks that are interested in the program are usually coming either from consulting rotational programs or from large corporates where they've been working as engineers or data scientists, or folks that are finishing up investment banking rotations and are very interested in either developing a new skill set and maybe transitioning into product or growth, or are interested in the opportunity to live and work abroad for a period of time and understand how the different business environments look in those markets. And so it's been 6 years of the program. We've had 101 people go through it to date, and about 13% of them actually stayed full time in the countries that they went to and at the companies that they joined. So it's been just an incredible program that's exceeded all of our expectations in terms of the number of people interested, the incredible quality of the people that have reached out to us and matched with our companies, and the impact that it's had both for our companies and for the fellows that have gone through it. So it's been a really exceptional program, I think, and excited to continue doing it in the coming years.
It's so cool. I think also just for the people who get to participate, I'm sure it's a lot of fun, and it's great to just give people more exposure to emerging markets, because once you do get that exposure, it makes you realize that there is that opportunity there, how it is actually on the ground in these places. So very cool. I guess we're running up on time a little bit now. I was wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to share or any other thoughts that you would like to get out.
No, I think I just want to say thank you for giving us the chance to share a bit more about Alter and our thesis and the way that we're pursuing it in these markets, and to extend an open invitation to founders that are building in this space or other investors, angels, funds that are interested in learning more about these markets. I am very, very grateful to be able to speak about them, and am passionate about continuing to advocate for these markets as regions in the world to focus more investment dollars into. So if there is anyone that listens and this is interesting to, please reach out to us. I'll make sure that my information is easily available, and as is the rest of our teams. We would love to hear from you.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining on. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.